Your elasticity is your greatest strength was a piece of feedback that I got on a performance review a while back, and it's stuck with me ever since. To me, elasticity has always been something that you design for when scaling up and down or out different infrastructure components for the software that runs on top of it. I hadn't really thought of it as necessarily a skill or a strength per se. But as knowledge workers, your ability to learn difficult things quickly is an incredibly useful skill and a necessary skill. So in this video, I will share with you how I approach learning new skills by turning them into projects. So what you see here is the end result of a learning project that I have scoped and kind of set a schedule for. So this is the end result, and what I want to do is walk you through how I got to this document and how it's guiding my learning and keeping me accountable, and how it helps me to complete a particular learning project and scope. So you'll notice that the title says Ultralearning Project, Build a Web Service with Go. So the Ultralearning Project is to give credit to the author of Ultralearning, Scott Young, in his book about accelerating your learning and learning quickly. So this template more or less came from his book, Ultralearning. You should definitely check it out. It's a fantastic and phenomenal resource to kind of give you a framework for approaching learning. And I've definitely taken that and integrated that into how I approach new skills. And this template has proven useful for me in several topics, and so I've kept it. But how did I get here? Let's take a step back and figure out the second part of the title, which is Build a Web Service with Go. So you'll notice that it's kind of specific. And so to begin with, what I realized was I wanted to figure out how to use this programming language that I had learned, Go, to do something with it. And one of the things that it's popular for is building web services. And this I stumbled upon this by just exposing myself to some of the literature out there on the programming language itself. So I spent a little bit of time in the step one, do your research. So the things that are listed in here under primary resources are the ones that I've vetted, but they're not the ones that I've not the only ones that I've consumed per se to come to this conclusion. But the first step that you want to do when you're approaching a new learning project is to go into what I call a meta learning research spike. So essentially what that is you just kind of start with a topic. And so I probably would have started with Go web development as my first keyword as I was going through this particular project. And you'll notice that it's far more refined on the second line now than it was in the beginning. Again, this document here is the end result of this meta learning research spec that I just mentioned. So the very first thing you're going to do when you do this is you're going to pick a topic. Maybe it's Go, the language itself, or maybe it's Kubernetes, or maybe it's some other different task that you want to go and learn. And so what you first start with is that topic, and then you go and research and you try to just expose yourself to that particular area of knowledge. So I'd probably be reading blog posts, picking up some books or getting some samples of some books and skimming through them. You're not just diving in head first and emerging 30 hours a month later and completely exhausted from that particular topic. You're really just trying to get an exposure to the particular area that you're interested in, so you know enough to craft your learning project effectively. So if we fast forward a little bit, I had consumed a number of things. I actually watched probably about 50% of this course on Udemy, so I sunk about 10 hours into that. And then I've just read a number of different blogs. I went and talked to experts, people that I know that professionally write Go for a living, and what resources they'd recommend. And then I came up with this primary resources list. So these are the 3 resources that are my primary ones that I'll be consuming. And then I have this backup materials here for things that were somewhat relevant, but not as high quality or not as relevant. So things that you don't want to let go of that you think are interesting and useful, you can put here, but you want to focus on the primary and limiting it, I would say probably to a handful, no more than 5. 3 is probably a good bet. Otherwise, you're just going to bury yourself in so much knowledge consumption that you'll never really get to the project work and solidify the knowledge. So that was, just to reiterate, you do a meta learning research spike, you go and figure out what the topic is, you collect some resources, and then now you would be ready to tackle and refine your approximate scope. So the approximate scope that I had, because there's a lot of facets to the web service, but I wanted to make it a little bit more tangible. I wanted to build something and do something with it for this to be considered a success. And so what I came up with in this particular project example is learn how to build a JSON-based web service written in Go that connects to a database. So as I was going through my meta-learning research spike, I discovered JSON's super popular. I already kind of knew that from an API perspective, a REST API perspective for handling the responses of those requests. Although I've never written an API, I've used them a lot. And I also knew that I wanted to be able to figure out how to connect and store that and persist the data from this web service in a database, because that's what all of them do. They put the data somewhere. And so that's how I came up with this more defined spike, or more defined scope and topic. So it's not, you'll notice, learn web development anymore, because that would take, that could be years. I want something that I can complete in a matter of weeks in this instance. But in the book, Ultralearning, Scott Young recommends that you scope it to probably 3 to 6 months maximum. In the book, he kind of famously did an MIT 4-year computer science degree, I think in like a year or 2 years or something insane like that. That's a little too high intensity for me. So I decided to scope it to something 2 weeks. So I've got my topic now, and I've got my scope. I have my primary resources. The biggest takeaway that I got from Ultralearning, the book, is this concept of directness or direct practice, which comes from deliberate practice and Peak, the book Peak. But really, like, how do I make sure that I am learning all these things in context? And what I mean by in context, it means in the environment in which that I would use this in the real world. And this is the biggest disconnect for people when they start learning projects or they start to learn things, is they think reading the book is enough or watching the course is enough. But you're learning it outside of context. You're learning it in the context of a predefined environment, and you're not actually coding and doing the thing. And the reason why that's so important is because without a deep expertise in something, you can't transfer that knowledge from that context. So you can't transfer the knowledge from the book to your project unless you've done a project. And so that's why project-based things are so much better for learning, especially technology, because then you're practicing and learning in the context in which you do it. And so you don't have to worry about that transfer. You don't have to get such a deep expertise that it transfers over into other contexts. So my direct practice is when I figure all this out, and maybe I've walked through these books and courses, I want to build a web service that allows me to store my favorite books in a database by hitting the API endpoint. So that's my goal. That's my direct practice. So even though maybe I follow along all these things and I built an API and so forth in these different resources, I then have to hold myself accountable and go and build my own little thing that forces me to use the skills that I learned while I was reading. And I can do this simultaneously. I don't have to wait till the end. I can start to build this up as I'm going through the material and walking through the book. And that makes the learning far more active. And I already touched on the backup material, so I'll skip over that. So the next and very important thing is scheduling your time. So below here will look very much like an implementation intention, which is a concept in numerous things. Willpower is one, but the most famous example is Atomic Habits by James Clear. James Clear actually wrote the foreword for Ultralearning, so they're a perfect pair. So if you haven't read Atomic Habits, definitely read Ultralearning and vice versa. But the next thing is that you have to answer 3 questions. The first one is, how much time are you going to commit? For me, I've got about an hour in the morning, 7 days a week that I can commit to this. And then the next question, which is when you're going to do that learning. For me, it'll be 5:30 in the morning to 6:30 in the morning. And that might fluctuate, but that's kind of my agreement with myself, my intention. And then what's the length of the project? So you can kind of give yourself a deadline. I like to put my learning into sprints. So sprints is the concept from agile software development. 2 weeks is a typical sprint. And so I try to break things down into 2-week things. I find anything beyond a month gets a little tedious unless it's a very big project, like writing a book, which took me 18 months last time, which was a terrible experience, and I should have done a better job scoping it. But anyway, the length of the project for me is going to be 2 weeks, 14 days, and I have a target end date of the 1st of next year. So hopefully I will be able to build a web service in Go where I can store my favorite books in a database by hitting an API endpoint by the new year. So that's how I walk through and approach learning new topics. Now, I don't do this with everything. If I'm just trying to explore an area or learn a little bit, that I don't go through this rigmarole. But if it's something that I want to learn well and that I'm procrastinating a ton on, this is typically the template that I fall back to and fill out for intentional learning. If you've enjoyed this video, please let me know by liking the video and or leaving a comment below. If you have any other learning tips, I'm always open to those, so please let me know if you have any of those. And while you're at it, might as well subscribe. I'll be releasing a couple of videos as I go through this learning project about how I'm approaching it, how I'm learning. And as always, thank you for watching.